Come on. Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I hope everyone is doing okay today. I have a damn interesting guest. So, Jason Unruhe, damn it, I hate when that happens. I have an awesome guest today. I have Jason Unruhe. He's a YouTube political commentator. You may know him from Maoist Rebel News. He's frequent host or frequent guest on Press TV. Jason, please tell the audience hello.
Hi.
Okay. Yeah, to be fair, I did say just please tell the audience hello. So I came across Jason a few months ago, but recently he did a video discussing Ocasio-Cortez. Now, I found this video to be amazing because it's a perspective of Ocasio-Cortez that goes from her left, meaning I hope you're okay with me saying, essentially a communist who's criticizing someone who's calling himself a democratic socialist, saying that, look, let's be honest, this woman is not a socialist and this democratic socialist stuff. But the interesting part to this, I kind of made this point that the critique is earnest from the left. And in the same way I would critique like the Democratic Party, you're critiquing what's taking place from the standpoint of what they're trying to accomplish as a democratic socialist. Would you like to expand upon that for the moment? In fact, before we get to that point, how on earth did you involve yourself into becoming a communist or a Maoist? I'm fascinated and curious by this.
All right, the story goes back to, say, maybe 1 or 2 years after I left high school. This was, I'm an 80s kid. I was born in 81. So when I left high school, I left it in 2000. So, and NAFTA went through in 96. So it took a couple of years for the real effect of NAFTA to take place, where all of a sudden, all those jobs, went overseas, and then all the wages came way down, the busting of the unions, etc. So I was still filled with what I was told. Oh, this is the best country in the world. If you work hard, you'll get to the top. And then I get out here and I'm like, these jobs suck.
It was like, that's not the way it is at all.
And it's like, okay, well, schools suck too. So let's see, the pay, it's all minimum wage. And then you go to a place and it says, we need you to lift boxes. We're looking for someone to lift boxes onto a conveyor belt, 2 years experience. I'm like, it's lifting boxes. Why I gotta have 2 years experience to lift a box? That's dumb. So then I just kicked around some, the temp agency jobs. You get 1 week here, you get 1 week there. And so like I tried a lot of different things because that was it. I couldn't find a job. So I had to keep going to the temp agency and getting like jobs 1 day here, 1 day there, or a week or whatever. And it's like, this kind of isn't what I told it was going to be like. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong here. I didn't go to college, so maybe that's what it was.
So it's like, this is all my fault. I am not doing something right in this particular system. It's all on me.
And then I got a job working at a furniture store where I was in the warehouse, the small furniture store. So I was the only one in the warehouse. And I just finished assembling a bunch of furniture to go out on the show floor. And it was my breaks. So I kicked back. And you know how they have displays for the furniture that's on sale and something like bookcases, and they just throw a bunch of books in there to make it look full. And one of them was the Communist Manifesto, because it was just a bunch of books that they had grabbed from like a sale so that they could just stock the shelf. So I'm thinking, okay, what is this? And I started reading. I'm like, oh, actually, that kind of makes sense. Now, the Communist Manifesto is full of a lot of antiquated language. So
it is. Yeah.
I had to go online, look up, and like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense. This kind of explains what was going on. And then from there, you read more, and you read more, and there you have it.
Yeah. It's funny. I read that maybe, I think it was several years ago. And it's euphoric in an interesting way. Like the argument that he makes, even going back to Marx and Engels, when you get into some of the other books, I don't consider myself anything. But by the same token, I can see how using various lenses in order to understand the world, that lens is an amazing explanation of the capitalistic system and the contradictions that are built into that system. Um, but you would agree with me that like uh, reading the Communist Manifesto is a little bit different than all of a sudden just becoming a communist. Like, what was the tipping point? What was the thing that said, and I don't ask this in this kind of perfunctory way. I ask this because I'm actually interested. I'm curious.
Yeah,
It's a unique thing. Like you have to admit the you what I heard when I was listening to, everybody's in their own subculture. Like everybody's in their own bubble. The left, for the most part, is a bubble. The Democratic Party is a bubble. Republican Party. Everybody has their own bubble, and those bubbles bump up against one another. One not necessarily being better than the other, just various perspectives, analyzing other perspectives. So when I was watching in many of your videos, there seemed to be a subculture dealing with this idea of first world and third world. I guess what I'm getting at is, what was the thing? Like, what was the impetus? What were the stones that allowed you to go from, I am looking for a job, believing in the capitalistic system and all of this stuff is my fault, to more systemic approach to looking at the world, and the world doesn't work in the way that the world is going, and we need radical revolutionary change. Do you see what I mean? That's
yeah.
not one step. That seems to be a few steps.
I'd say that I largely lived my life completely apolitical as a teenager. Politics was like, I don't care, whatever. I think the only political thing I can remember is from being a little kid when the Soviet Union came to an end, and it was just like, I was like 9 years old, so it was like, whatever, or 10 years old. I remember Desert Storm, and then not thinking anything of that. And then the next thing was like in the 90s when we had the Quebec separation vote, when Quebec wanted to leave the rest of Canada, and I paid attention a little bit there, but I didn't really pay any attention. Nothing. I didn't care. Like, this wasn't something that was real. Like, that's
and I think that's what people consider as like
a lot of the stuff doesn't seem like it's real until you're out in the real world, and you're like, and then everything just hits you like a ton of bricks. Like, this is all real stuff. This really does affect your life, and like I feel like a dumbass for all those years, not thinking that it was really anything. What happened was that I started reading a lot of Marxist literature, and then a lot of stuff started to make sense. And then I asked some people, and they're like, Stalin killed my grandfather or some shit or something like that. Like,
right.
Okay.
And I'm not laughing at that. I'm laughing at
it is funny.
People make this association immediately. Marx, Stalin. It's like, but those aren't the same thing. But I know what you mean. It's like they immediately make this association between you're reading Karl Marx to, oh my God, you're Stalinist. Stalin murdered, millions of people, that type of stuff. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I was like, well, you're not really answering what I'm saying. You're just kind of screaming at me. That's not really an answer. So I was like, okay, why? Okay, everybody doesn't even want to talk about it. They just, okay, well, that's fine. Then I start reading some more, and then so like I gained a better understanding of how things were, why things are the way they are, and realized, yeah, this system is kind of complete bullshit.
Yeah,
it's bullshit. So I started reading more, and then I started getting better informed, and it developed until I discovered YouTube. Until I was able to interact with other Marxists. Until that point, I was the only one I knew.
I see.
Then once, YouTube started, like the real kickoff for social media, then I started meeting other people. And then we started discussing. I started talking to other people and learning new stuff. And then essentially the ideology evolved over time. It became, okay, I understand this, and now it's possible for me to understand this. Mm-hmm. Like climbing a ladder kind of thing. Until you understand the thing that's before it, it's hard to understand the thing after it.
No, I understand.
So eventually it became like climbing a ladder, understanding, okay, I get Marx. So what's with Lenin? So then I started reading Lenin. Okay, his theoretical contributions on top of Marx were correct. and he corrected some things that were not the same. Obviously, World War I, 1919 is not 1850. The
That's
world
true.
has changed since that time. And then Mao came along, and he created even other ideas to add on. The 1960s are not the same. Post World War II is not the same as World War I.
Right. The world changes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the world changes. Even class changes over that time. So I started thinking, well, how come we, I don't know, so we all of a sudden just stopped at 1960, and there's been really nothing since then.
Mhm.
Well, okay, the world's not the same as it was since 1960. And then I discovered a thing called Third-worldism from an organization called the Leading Light Communist Organization. And I started reading a lot of their stuff. And I was like, okay, this actually kind of explains some things, why certain things did happen, why certain things didn't happen.
Mhm.
And it made a lot of the unanswered questions clear. So it was like a slow evolution in theory, understanding the different contributions by the different, what we call heads of Marxism. Like when you see all the
I
guys'
see.
heads.
Like essentially one takes it to the next level.
Yeah. And then I started learning them all. I was like, okay, this actually really makes sense. This is, I believe a lot of people disagree with me. The highest form of third-worldism would be the highest form of Marxist theory. And that's basically how I got to where I am today.
Let me ask you this. So what would be, I guess you can say, the transition between Lenin versus Marx? So what would be the thing that Lenin got right that Marx got wrong? I'm just curious on your point of view. I have an idea of what this may be, but what would be that thing, or a few things if you have more than one?
Yeah. The main thing is that Lenin theorized imperialism as a product of capitalism, which did not exist during Marx's time. So Marx couldn't theorize it because the thing didn't exist. So somebody new had to come along and analyze this, and that was his major contribution. He predicted both world wars. He predicted basically how they were going to happen, because his analysis of international capital competing with each other, coming up against the edges of their borders, like they can only expand so much. Capital always has to expand. If it doesn't, it's going to collapse. And eventually, groups of capitals from different countries are kind of come up against each other, and it becomes, well, whatever room is left, it's going to be, someone's going to have to fight over it. It's kind of like a more economic version of colonialism, let's say. Well,
Okay.
hence the term neo-colonialism is imperialism. That's what he called it. So this was what preceded the two world wars that happened. He also mentioned something where Marx was essentially wrong. He said revolution was going to come from the advanced sections of the working class in the more developed nations, which at that time was Germany and England,
Yeah,
which
they
did
thought
not
Germany was
happen.
going to.
That did not happen. The first revolution came from Russia, which was like the most backward country in Europe. And then the next great one came from China, which was even more underdeveloped. It was still semi-feudal. So his prediction that the more advanced sections of the working class bringing the revolution did not happen. And a lot of Marxists get really angry if you point this out. I mean, you can't just get mad because you don't like it. It's true. All the revolutions happened in the more backward, more oppressed countries. Cuba, Vietnam, to some degree, Laos, China, Russia. These were all the more backward countries. The opposite of what Marx predicted is what happened. And there's no shame in admitting that in that regard, he was wrong.
Yeah, none at all. I mean, it's not. It's a theory. It's a hypothesis. I mean, for the most part, Marx is saying this is the model that I think of the capitalistic system and the contradictions that are applied to it. There are going to be certain things that apply. There are going to be certain things that don't. I don't necessarily see the problem with saying this needs to be tweaked or that needs to be tweaked. It's not the Bible. It's not them trying to make this perfect thing. Like anything else, there are going to be things that excels and things that it doesn't. Let me actually. So one of the things I would think would be this idea that Marx thought the revolution would just kind of materialize on its own, as opposed to Lenin thought it needs to be pushed. I got to be honest. I kind of agree with Lenin on this. I don't necessarily. I think there's a certain amount of political theater that's always built into trying to get something across to, I guess, a large group of people. I don't know if that happens without a nudge. Let me ask you this other part. Going to Mao, you said Mao expanded the ideas over what Lenin introduced. What were the ideas that Mao expanded into? Because at one point you were calling yourself a Maoist.
Yes.
Why Mao?
Now, what happened was then we move into the post-World War II era, where the Soviet Union was able to, a lot of countries became socialist because of the Soviet Union. So essentially they were helping them do it rather than coming to revolution themselves. I mean, come on, that's not that's not controversial to say. That's what happened. So China came into a revolution, and they had what was called the 13 and a half Bolsheviks. Basically, it was a group of cadre of Chinese revolutionary intellectuals / fighters that were trained in the Soviet Union. And while there were Marxists in China at the time, so they came in, they came to the Chinese Communist Party, and they said, okay, the industrial workers are the central force of the revolution. And so they organized upon those lines. The problem is that 87% of the population was peasants.
Yeah.
So you're kind of not reaching the masses by doing that. So they tried their tactic to carry out a revolution in the cities and failed miserably. Like, they were just slaughtered. This is what led to going on the Long March, the great tactical retreat to get away from the Nationalist Party. And then it was at that time Mao said, okay, no, you guys really screwed up. And he argued not to quit and give up revolution, but to go on the tactical retreat, go into the countryside, rebuild your forces, find out what went wrong, what to do different next time. And, they took the 14 months to go the 6,000 miles through the mountains to eventually settle in the countryside. And what he did was he sat down, he investigated, and, well, okay, basically everybody in the country is a peasant. Maybe we should be starting from that point rather than that group of people that virtually doesn't exist, because we saw where that leads us. Yeah. So it became an investigation into the peasants of the Hunan countryside, and it became the question of the peasants. Okay, our class situation is not the same as the class situation that Marx wrote about. It's not really this. It's not even the same one that Lenin wrote about. And it's certainly not the one that exists in the first world. There was no first world yet, but the advanced countries at the time. So we have to base this off the peasants, and we do that through land reform. So he basically confirmed that, yeah, it's got to come from the more backward people. Then he made adding contributions to the theories of imperialism. His work, I recommend, because these are the two most important ones, On Practice and On Contradiction. He basically came to the conclusion that we cannot have a revolution while the Japanese are occupying us. So they reached out to the nationalist parties. You want them out. We want them out. Okay, let's work together, defeat the Japanese, and then we can fight amongst ourselves for the future of China. And the nationalists eventually came around and said, okay, yeah, we should do that. So they cooperated, defeated the Japanese occupation, and then they fought it out themselves. And the smart thing was that the Chinese Communist Party massively grew during that time. And then eventually the civil war came between the nationalists and the communists, and the nationalists were defeated and the Chinese took over. He understood that while society is made up of several contradictions, that until that time seen as the working class and the capitalist class, Mao said, well, there's other contradictions as well, and that one is a primary and one is a secondary. These are secondary ones. We had to defeat imperialism first before we could have a revolution. So that was the primary contradiction, imperialism, and the secondary was between the capitalist class and the workers. So we had to resolve the first one to be able to get around to resolving the others, which is why I say, like, you're never going to get rid of racism, sexism, etc. inside of capitalism. It's not going to happen. You have to get rid of capitalism in order to do that.
Before you can get rid of now, so I think there's a certain logic to it. During times where there was stress in a society, like economic stress, you would find that racial violence went up. There were more hangings and everything else. It's almost like it's a pressure cooker, and you have these people competing with one another, just trying to fight for scraps. 95% of the wealth went to the top 1%. Think about that. If you essentially throw meat into a bunch of starving rats, what the hell is going to take place with that meat? And finding all of these different distinctions that you use in order to kind of slice people up. And I don't disagree with you on this. The interesting thing, the Mao, though, I mean, what do you say to people who say Mao had a lot of deaths associated with him in regards to the reforms that he himself, or the quote unquote reforms that he was making? Is there any issue calling yourself a Maoist knowing that this was taking place? And I'm asking this because
to that, I would answer one of the things that people complained about the violence during the revolution, and Mao's answer was, revolution is not a dinner party. It's not embroidery. It's not something that's going to be nice and safe. It's going to be violent. It's going to be bloody. That's what a revolution is. If there wasn't a problem to begin with, then we wouldn't need to be doing this. Okay, a revolution is bloody. A revolution has to happen.
Essentially, there's always a lift. Like, if you want to give it, like for Martin Luther King, or to get any level of civil rights, there has to have been something that was exchanged, which is pain, somebody being hit and beaten and everything else, and having that struggle to take place over those long, protracted years. There had to be a lift. I think that's your point. That's the point that you're trying to make. The fact that the society is screwed up, in order to fix society in a certain way, there has to be something that materially happens to society to get it to change.
The enemy is not going to go away by himself.
Okay. Now,
post-revolution, some of the reforms, this is largely exaggerated. There were famines, of course. What I think is interesting is that there was one famine in China under socialism and then never again. But pre-socialism, famines happened all the time. Like they went on regular cycles. So there was one that went under socialism and then never again, but somehow it's socialism's fault.
So you're trying to say it's not necessarily attributable to Mao. These famines were happening all the time. It just so happened to happen while Mao was in power.
Yes, and Mao certainly did criticize a lot of the errors that were made. He said they found that people were exaggerating how much they had produced to look better. And he said, don't do that because you're going to screw up our planning if you do that. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's what he warned about. Don't exaggerate. You have to tell the truth, or we can't plan accordingly. And then it hit, and they were not fully prepared for it.
Is it fair to say that the capitalistic system also has those type of incentives, in which case people are being pushed and prodded to behave in particular ways that aren't necessarily for the societal good? That's a flaw. In the same way, this idea of Mao having to tell people don't do X is some indication that there was a flaw in that particular system. Is that fair? I mean, ultimately, there's an incentive that is driving people to behave in ways that are going against the societal benefit.
A lot of people were looking at it as in how good they looked. They didn't make any more money.
Oh, I know, but it doesn't matter whether it's money.
By far, it's not perfect. No.
Yeah.
There is that tendency for people exaggerate all the time, regardless of what system or culture or country or language. There's always going to be people that exaggerate in order to promote themselves.
It's funny. I have this bad habit of saying this video is not going to take long, and it's like 2 hours later. And they're like, what the hell? How are you saying 5 minutes in it's not going to take long? No, my point is, you're right. People do exaggerate. I guess I'm just saying, like you said, if they exaggerate those yields in order to make themselves look better, it produces problems in regards to how they try to accrue, the socialist system. But I guess my point is, you're not attributing those to Mao. And I have to be honest, I don't know enough about this to kind of push back one way or the other on this. But
I would say that I would take probably the same stance that Mao took. Mao said that it was like 70% policy, 30% stuff beyond their control. Because that kind of famine thing was going to come, and they knew it was coming because it happens all the time. Here's what we need to do in order to prepare for it. And then it became, well, you lied about your production quotas and stuff like that, and we did not get as much as we thought we did. So he does attribute it to actual people, like not just, it was just the weather. The weather's what caused it, but it would not have been what it was had people done what they were supposed to do. Now, this is very different compared to the other countries who at the same time suffered huge famines.
But they never bring those up.
But they don't bring those up.
Those never get brought up. All right, so let's jump for the moment to modern politics because I wanted to give one last thing. Third worlders. I don't understand fully what this is. I think I have an idea of what this is, but and forgive me, I don't mean to put you under a microscope. I'm trying to understand this area of the internet because I have to be honest, I did not know that this area existed, and so I'm fascinated.
Because it's very small.
Yeah. So, what is third worlder or third worldism, as it's called?
This is what we describe as there's Marx, Lenin, Mao, and then third worldism, because there's no particular one guy that put the theory together. It's largely a lot of people that have contributed ideas that has not been fully formed into a complete cohesive theory. Although the LLCO does have their own version of third worldism, which some of it I would disagree with, but they have the most complete version of it.
Well, give me an example of what that is. I mean, naming is not necessarily,
okay.
It's not giving me an idea.
They would say that there is no exploitation in the first world. I believe that's wrong. There is exploitation in the first world. Of course there is.
There's no exploitation in the first world? That's nonsense. People are being exploited. Now, the guy who's working at McDonald's
I can understand why they would say that. Actually, McDonald's would be one of the few examples of where there is exploitation.
Walmart.
I would not necessarily, because they would argue, and as I would argue, those workers don't make anything. They are a necessary part of the process of getting the commodity to the consumer, but they are not the direct producer of it. When you have, somebody who's making I don't know, it depends on what the minimum wage is in the various states.
Yeah, I think it's like $7.
$7 an hour.
Compare that to $10 an hour. I think it's like $7.
Okay, it's $7.
Very low. Yeah.
And then compare that to the guy who produced it, who was probably making like $2 a day.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's not necessarily the difference between the two, but that the third world super exploitation subsidizes the first world workers' wages. And that's not to say that it can't suck living in the first world. Like I said, I've had plenty of shit jobs. I worked at a chicken plant for minimum wage.
Yeah.
Coming home drenched in chicken blood and like that every day. It fucking sucks.
Now, would you consider that exploitation? Or but again, you would say, well, look, at the very least, you have enough to put a roof over your head, and the people who are essentially getting you that chicken is essentially living in shit and piss.
Yeah.
So it's like the exploitation is taking place earlier in the food chain. And by the time you get to the point of, let's say, selling it through Walmart or selling it through somewhere else, the exploitation has already taken place. And there may be a certain degree of exploitation, but it is in no way the same thing as what's taking place in what you would say to be the third world. Is that fair?
Yeah, correct. But I would say the difference in those levels of exploitation, I mean, you could sit down and calculate numbers for amount of value created forever, and you could hash out those numbers. The point is which one of those people in the chain is going to pick up a gun and fight. And as we had seen from the previous revolutions, it has not been the advanced countries. It's not been the more advanced sections of the working class. It's always been the lower, as Lenin liked to say, the lower and deeper sections of the proletariat. I got into a confrontation with I shouldn't call it a confrontation. It was an argument. But a friend of mine got into an argument with some people from the Communist Party of Australia.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we have to go with the workers, the miners in the country. And they're the industrial working class. We have to go with them. And said, like, some of the guys make like $90,000 a year. And it's hard to walk up to a guy who has 2 cars, a house, a pension.
Like, you need to pick up a gun and fight the system, man.
Yeah, just throw all that away and pick up a gun. He's not going to do it. And my friend argued, well, what about the Aborigines in Australia? A lot of these mining companies, they're going into the native land to the Aboriginals and forcing them off it, and taking their land and just ripping all the minerals and stuff out of it. We should be allying with those Aboriginals that are like completely oppressed. Like, like they're very much like Native Americans and whatnot, in that if you go to some places, it's outright third world.
You
Like,
know, there's a logic to this that I
yeah,
think you're right.
and the logic was, why don't you want to side with them? Oh, because we side with the workers. Because if you did side with the natives of Australia, you would be undermining the wealth of those workers who work in the mines. That's kind of a chauvinism right there.
Well, that's interesting, and here's the thing. I think you have a logic to it. I think there is a logic to it, and I think you're somewhat right. Even, and let me explain what I mean. Reforms oftentimes in society are used to stem the tide against people, you know, that are pissed off. It's like people are angry, they're pissed off, they're about to strike, and it's like, all right, here, we're gonna raise your wages by $1. Okay, fine. It's like, all right, you know, it tamps down, or here's Social Security, here's Medicare, and then all of these people who are pissed off calms down. Now, the catch becomes, at some point, when you get to the point where there's enough pressure on the society where just existing becomes more of a pain in the ass than doing something, then I think you've reached that inflection point where people can't just sit still. It's like they're pissed off and oppressed and suppressed to the point where they don't believe that change can come through the apparatus itself, in which case they believe that the only solution is pushing back. And I think your point is, you don't reach that point in the sense where somebody's making $90,000 a year, because those people, even if they may be somewhat pissed off and annoyed by the way things are, they're at the end of the day still making $90,000 a year.
No,
Is that fair? Like, it's essentially, you need chaos and stress to some degree to get the revolutionary fires.
It has to be a point where they're going to realize revolution is the only solution. I mean, largely when you talk to a lot of people, like even progressives, they don't want a whole new system. They just want the existing one to change in a way that would be better for people. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. I mean, everybody wants to be better off. Nobody wants to be, sitting there worried about being homeless. Yeah. Nobody wants to, like, sitting there, oh, which bill is it I'm going to be able to pay this month? So I completely understand that. And yeah, first world poverty can really suck. I mean, like, you could see those people out in California that are like with the whole friggin' shanty town.
Yeah, have you seen that? Oh God,
yeah,
that's horrendous.
The question is, who is it that's going to pick up the gun?
Well, right there, and I think, and this will fast forward into the current system. I don't think lefties. It's not so much that they're bothered by this idea of a new system. I think they're bothered by this idea of who's going to pick up the gun. That phrase in and of itself scares the shit out of people, because at that point you're talking about chaos and you're talking about
it's not worth it to them.
So let's get to this point. So your analysis of American politics. Now, who's going to pick up the gun? Let's linger there for the moment. Who are you willing to shoot in order to make this work? Are you willing to shoot the local cop? Like, who's the person who you're pulling a bullet in order to bring about this revolution?
Now, the logic of revolution is obviously whoever's defending the system. I'm not saying you should go out and shoot cops, because that would be illegal. I'm not saying you should go out and shoot members of the military, because that would also be illegal.
Wait. Just to be clear, though, I mean, if you're talking about a revolution, that goes beyond the current system. It's like Batman. Batman doesn't follow the laws. Batman goes beyond the law because Batman doesn't believe that the law is adequate to do what he needs to do. In some degree, if you're saying who's picking up the gun, you're saying, I don't agree with the system and I don't believe you can work within the system. So this idea of saying, I'm not going to shoot a cop because it's against the law, is kind of a
No, I know. Right? I'm just saying that I wouldn't tell you to do it, because that would be illegal.
Fair enough. Okay.
I'm not advocating any kind of violence against the government, because that's the kind of thing that gets your ass ended up in Guantanamo Bay.
Okay, but we're talking hypothetical in this case. So
okay, in a hypothetical situation, the first line of defense for the capitalist class would be the police.
Yes, it would be.
And the police are very, very wedded to that system.
Yeah, they're brutes. They're animals. I mean, ultimately,
Well, the cops suck. I mean, no question. The cops suck.
oftentimes it's like the protectors. There was this plutocrat. I can't think of the guy's name. He said, I could pay half of the population to murder the other half of the population. And that half of the population would be cops, essentially beating and kicking and hurting and injuring. And they do this all across the country, all across the world, believing in this idea that they're doing what's best to pertain law and order, when ultimately they're beating people who are in their socioeconomic class with a complete false consciousness as they go about their way. But I guess the point I'm getting at is you can understand that people, even if they want a different system, have qualms about this idea of your route to this is killing a lot of people. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's totally fair. The thing is, because they don't see it as the only thing. They don't see it as that's going to be the solution. Well, we don't really have to go killing people. I mean, we can always, if we can't get the douchocrats to do something, then we can always get, like a Bernie Sanders if we just try really hard, because they don't see revolution as being the only solution. They still see other avenues that they would rather do before going to that. I think a good way of looking at it is there's a common thing called the radical break, and that is to do something in terms of revolution to where you cannot go back. For China, those the haircut called the Q, where it's like half of the head of hair and then in the long back into a braid.
It's like there's no going back now.
Right. What they would do is they would cut the braid off and say, "That's it. I'm not being a part of this anymore." And that's an unforgivable thing to do. You can't do that. So once you do that, you ain't coming back. In Nepal, when they were having their revolution, a woman would pick up a gun and say, "That's it. I'm a revolutionary now." And that was unforgivable for a woman to do. But that would be their break. I am breaking from this society and there's no coming back from it. We don't have that here. There's no real break that you can make. I mean, you could go out and shoot a cop. I mean, you ain't coming back from that. They will hunt your ass down for
right,
100 years if it's necessary.
Right.
They will, they're gonna, Dorner your ass eventually.
But this is exactly my point. Like, I don't. All right, so for the moment, let's flip to Ocasio and let's flip to Sanders. So, what is your perspective of Sanders? Like, what is? Because it's funny. I've seen, they were calling Obama a socialist and communist. It was like, what the hell? Are you shitting me? Obama has described himself as a conservative. When he's like, he says, I'd be a moderate conservative. What is your Ocasio-Cortez calls herself a socialist, democratic socialist. Now, Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. Alex Jones has come out and said we have a new communist in Congress.
There's your first mistake.
What is, from the perspective of somebody who's actually somewhat of a real communist, what is your critique of Ocasio-Cortez, and what do you think the problem from your perspective of somebody like Sanders and Cortez in the political landscape of actually trying to get something accomplished?
Okay, Cortez and Sanders are a reflection of people are really fed up with the way things are. I mean, there's no doubt. There's no doubt people are angry at a lot of the things that are wrong with the world, and this wrong with the way American society is. There's a lot of messed up things about it. And their elections, the support for them is a reflection of that.
Yeah.
The problem is that they can't essentially do it because they're working within the system. And one of the critiques that third-worldism has, I mean, this even goes back to even Lenin, the great struggle over the Second International was that the more advanced countries, England, Germany, etc., were pushing in the way of social democracy. Okay, maybe we don't have to do revolution. We can just do this social democracy thing. Get some people elected, create a big welfare state. We don't have to do the whole violence thing. And Lenin was like, no, shoot yourself. You're stupid. You have to have a revolution. You're going to end up in the same thing. That's why a lot of the social democratic countries ended up becoming imperialist, because they were still relying on capitalism. And that still has the certain logic to capital accumulation, et cetera, that they have to follow. I mean, as long as it's capitalism, capital has to do what capital has to do, and there's no getting away from that. Even if you have a big welfare state, a state-owned enterprise still has to follow the same laws as a privately owned business in terms of making profits.
The rule set is built into the system
the way
itself.
capital works, it can't get around that. It can make some slight alterations, it can make a few exceptions, but in the end, it has to do what it has to do, and no amount of regulation is going to change that.
Ultimately, you're saying these guys are Fukuyamas. It's the best that they can do is a few social programs and a welfare state, like a social democracy, as opposed to actually having something that fundamentally changes the way the system is organized.
Yeah. And because of the way the first world is, those concessions, those social democratic reforms are affordable. You could do it. Oh, you could have universal healthcare in the US easily. I'll just get rid of that military budget. You'd have money for everything. You could have, it's the richest country in the world. You could have the most amazing shit. Like what NASA could do with the US military budget in a year would be like, we'd already be on Mars growing.
You know, the most angering thing, $21 trillion in debt. It's like you could have a hyperloop going from Florida to Los Angeles. You could, like you said, everyone has healthcare, robotic cars, you know, no one having to pay for trains and subway. Like there's so much you could do for all of this money, and we've squandered it, murdering people around the globe. It's aggravating. It's utterly aggravating.
But the US military has to do what it does. It has to maintain the empire. It has to keep expanding. There's no other choice. I mean, this is capital. This is capital on a global scale. This is what it has to do. The US is an empire, and the empire must expand, or else it's going to start shrinking. And if it starts shrinking, it's going to collapse.
Well, the problem is it has started shrinking. I mean, you have other countries that are around. The United States came up with this idea of exceptionalism. Now, this was nonsense. They're just human beings. But, you know, at the point where Europe has been completely decimated, where the Soviet Union has been completely decimated, where essentially you're the last man left standing and everyone else is buying your stuff. Yeah, you were pretty goddamn exceptional in that moment. Well, what happens when you're no longer a unipolar world and you have all of these countries in Europe creating a trade bloc? You have China that is going gangbusters from the standpoint of its kind of state capitalistic enterprise. And now you're getting a smaller share of the global market. And you've spent all of this money on military as opposed to building infrastructure and stuff like this. And now you're looking at the world recede away from you, pissing off our allies, siding with horrible figures around the globe. That is, I agree with you that it's a jobs program. I mean, ultimately, we spend $1 trillion a year on the jobs program, killing people around the globe. It's amazing. It's like every bullet that hits somebody is a job that we created or a job that we maintain. I guess my only critique here is not so much this idea of the need to change the system. I think people's issue is how to do it. And a bloody revolution is probably not the highest thing on people's list in order to bring that about. Like for example, is it fair to say that the Republican Party has been able to move the ball further and further and further to the right, year by year by year by year? And
absolutely.
If they've been able to do it, why is it completely impossible and barred? Meaning, because from the standpoint of the argument that I hear socialists make on this, that it is impossible to move the ball from the standpoint of something like a social democracy, where you're methodically taking out planks of the capitalistic system as opposed to screaming, let's have a bloody revolution and let's murder a lot of people and that's to overturn the system. Why is one impossible but the other is not? And what I mean by impossible, if it was me, I would run this like kind of a military enterprise where I would try to move the ball further to the left, taking out one plank of the capitalistic system at a time. For example, worker co-ops. Now, this is one of those plans that literally tries to eliminate the elite from the political process and allow workers to own the means of production. Now, I agree with you. This is still within the framework of a capitalistic system, but this is a plank out of the system. I guess what I'm saying is, with clever policy where you're in because my argument here is we haven't really had a left in the United States. where we haven't had anybody who actually tried to get things accomplished from the standpoint of undermining and getting rid of the system. The only thing we've ever had was people trying to work within the system. I'm saying, what happens when you have a strident group of aware, woke people who are literally working with this idea of trying to undermine, get rid of, and destroy the system the way the system is? Now, you're saying that's impossible. But I'm saying Republicans have been able to move the ball further to the right. Why is it impossible for somebody who's motivated on the left to do the same?
The reason is that the media power in the country is economic power. I mean, the richer you are, the more power you have.
Yeah.
They're all on the side of defending capitalism. As soon as you start threatening capitalism, even the Democrats will jump in and start, okay, yeah, we should do that. They own all the power. They have the economic power to destroy jobs. They can create jobs. They own all of the media. I mean, all media is owned by a capitalist. Yes. And they all have that interest in defending the system. So that's how they're able to do that. And the U.S. is kind of a unique thing and a place in that regard, because a lot of other places managed to push farther left, although they did get the job done and have the socialism. But the U.S. is really the exception there that went further to the right. There is, I say that it doesn't happen because the capitalist class owns all the power. I mean, there's even worker co-ops, and worker co-ops are a good thing. But in the end, a worker co-op cannot defeat Walmart. They cannot defeat Amazon. And in the end, they'll eventually be crushed.
Well, it depends. I mean, like again, when I think of this stuff, I think of this stuff as a war. I think we've been in an existential struggle where, like you said, the capitalist plutocratic class have been able to convince the public that class is not an issue, that we're all united, that we all say a pledge of allegiance, and we're walking hand in hand into the sun. You know, like this is the myth that perpetrates the country. So it's like as the bombs fall side by side, people are still asleep as if nothing is taking place. At the same token, they've been running on a hamster wheel. Their lives have been getting harder and harder. And because they're socialized into a frame of time, they don't quite understand that your life is getting harder and your life doesn't have to be this way. Now, assume for the moment, though, that you did have a motivated group, and that motivated group looked at this stuff on the context of a larger scale of time, not necessarily as individual things. So the co-op is just one thing. But the co-op is one thing in a larger plan of how do you undermine and break this system by pulling one plank after the next until the thing collapses. And I guess I'm making the point that nothing like that has existed in the United States. We've all, for the most part, like you say, we're unique in this, but we've been unique in this because of the Cold War, the way we've ramped up this idea of a Cold War tension, whereas the social democracies in Europe had to compare themselves to what they consider to be a more egalitarian system in the Soviet Union. Well, the United States didn't necessarily have to do that because, for the most part, we scream at the top of our lungs that you're a commie if you want healthcare. It's like, look at that commie! How dare you want healthcare? I guess I'm trying to make the point that the bloody revolution, there's a Howard Zinn thing where Howard Zinn makes this distinction between a good reason versus a good war. And just because you have a good reason doesn't necessarily mean you need a war. I'm skeptical that the only way to go about this is bloody murder and chaos in this way. And I don't necessarily think the argument is intact. Like, you can move the ball forward. And I give you this. Obama running that campaign with hope and change. Now, assume for the moment that if Obama actually meant it, what could have been taken place? Assume for the moment if you had a president or an office that says, not only are we going to enforce this idea of worker co-ops, we're going to assist it from the standpoint of government. Meaning, if a company is going to sell itself overseas, you're going to have to offer that to the employees first, and the government is going to give you a loan for it. I'm saying, isn't it fair to say that if you had somebody who actually meant it, a group that actually meant it and actually had a very specific goal in mind? What did Lenin say? That revolution is not half-assed. It's one of those things you have to plan and think about and do constantly. It's not something that you do part-time. What if you had that? are you still saying that it is impossible to get anything changed where the system itself moves if you're attacking that system one plank at a time? It's still impossible.
To which I would also answer by quoting Lenin: fascism is capitalism in decay.
Yeah.
As soon as it starts coming down, as soon as there's a real challenge to it, you will, you're going to see not necessarily the swastika, but something like it is going to pop up. That's exactly what happened in Germany. The system was completely wiped out from the reparations that were paid from the First World War, and communists were like the largest, most powerful group in the country. And the system, the capitalist class, did whatever it took to protect themselves, and that meant funneling money into the Nazis. Now, what would happen in the United States is not exactly what would happen in Nazi Germany. You don't necessarily have to have the whole racial dimension.
No, you would have cops riding around in Humvees shooting people. I mean, that's what you're saying. You would have people being declared as terrorists. Those people would be put into black sites. And in addition to putting people in black sites, you would be castigated on the media as violent thugs who are attacking cops. I mean, I guess I'm trying to get across a violent revolution. There's a reason why Martin Luther King didn't use violent revolution, because he didn't think it would work. He looked at this and said, how is the public going to receive this particular thing, meaning the loss of the moral high ground? Now, what I would tell you is you would be right in 100 years if you win. Because at that point, all revolutions, for the most part, gets kind of recede in the history, and there's this kind of glorious talking about what takes place, and people get accustomed to a particular worldview, meaning if you grew up in a socialistic society, that society would be all that you know. The world would be great. Nobody would care. But that's not where you are. And there's this always uneasy, precarious transition of trying to change this capitalistic hellscape into something that's more like the Venus Project type, where you're kind of or this kind of smashing of the government, where people are in a more egalitarian society where human beings matter more. It's like I agree with your aims, I think. I just, the bloody revolution thing is problematic to me. What happens on day 2 of the revolution in your mind? I'm curious.
Well, we could just look at what revolutions have done previously. The first thing necessary is to start creating the new institutions of power to replace the ones that existed.
Do you shoot the president?
I would actually argue, now a lot of people would disagree with me, but I would argue, whether that would be Obama, Trump, doesn't matter. Take that guy, lock him up. And you know what you do? You put him on trial.
You don't shoot.
No, you collect the evidence. You have a huge trial. Put it on television, broadcast it all over the world. Show every dirty deed that piece of shit ever did. Show all of their crimes for the whole world and say, this is why we overthrew them.
The problem is, Jason, everybody already knows. Like I think, and I gotta be honest, this is one of the most infuriating things to me about politics, where, during the Reagan administration, when the Iran-Contra affair took place, Ronald Reagan was essentially, selling weapons to supposed to be our enemies, but they're only our enemies because we overthrew their country and they overthrew it back. But our enemies, and trying to attack left-wing governments in South America, despite Congress telling them not to do it. He's essentially paying terrorists to take down left-wing governments. Now, this was a big deal. People were pissed off, like, holy shit, we're supposed to believe in freedom, justice, and equality, and Reagan is out there selling weapons to terrorists. What the hell? Now, the Gipper comes on TV, looks in the mug, and says, the buck stops with me. I didn't know anything about this, but, whatever. And they accept that. Obama, it's an amazing thing. They accept it. The Gipper says it, they accept it. Now, fast forward to 2012, 13, 14. The Obama administration is literally paying terrorists to undermine a government in Syria after doing the same thing in Libya, in which case they're literally selling black slaves. The irony of a black president in office presiding over a policy that ended up with black slaves. No issue. Nobody complained. Nobody bitch. When Tulsi Gabbard brings it up, Jake Tapper reflexively covers for Obama, saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" I mean, the government says they're not doing that, but they know. Jake Tapper
What does it
knows.
matter if they're doing it or not?
Well, I guess my point
happening.
is we're paying terrorists to undermine a government. Everybody knows. Nobody cares. So this idea of saying here are all the flaws of the government, those flaws are already known. Like I know there's a lot of nasty shit that our government has been doing. Donald Trump has been hiding the number of murders that we've been committing under the CIA program, meaning the drones. So it's like Obama, in a modest effort, takes it from out of the hands of the CIA. Mind you, 90% of the people we're killing in many of these cases were civilians. That number by itself just means he's murdering civilians. It's not even going after terrorists at that point. But that's something that we know. Think about that. We know thousands of people being murdered by this. And yet it goes on. George Bush kills 1 million people, admits openly, yeah, that's right, I said waterboard them. Black sites where we were renditioning people who were absolutely innocent of their crimes. And they're being broken apart. People know. They took that woman who was a torturer, who got rid of the information, who, if she steps foot in Europe, could be prosecuted for war crimes, and made her head of the CIA. The guy who lied to the world saying there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that ends up getting 1 million people killed, completely destabilizes that part of the globe. Mind you, with us assisting with the Syrian war, creating a bunch of refugees that were flooding into Europe, completely destabilizing the politics of Europe. Our policy has literally destabilized the world. I don't think that's a minor thing. The world knows. Nobody cares. Showing the sins of all of these people. The sins are already known. Like, do you see my point in this? Like,
no, I see your point.
And it's like, how do you win that particular revolution? I'm skeptical of violent revolutions. That's all. Because I don't think you can control them. I don't necessarily think you can predict where they're going to go. And at the end of the day, if you lose, and seeing as they have nuclear weapons, they have, pot-belly helicopter, I guess, is there another strategy other than violent revolution that may work?
I would say that if anything else has ever worked, let me know.
I love that answer.
I would also say
I love the honesty of that answer. It's like, look, I'm just saying some bad shit has to take place. And if there's some other way,
as Mao himself said, there is a great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent.
Yeah, I heard that. I heard that. It's but like, how is that? Everything
I would say
fine.
On a much more realistic level, one of the things that would be the catalyst would be a huge economic crisis.
Yes.
If that happened,
that could be
everything broke down. I mean, there's no jobs anymore. I'm talking like maybe Great Depression level shit.
No, I agree with you.
The door's open.
But right there, that could potentially catalyze or create a catalyst for change. That doesn't require people being murdered. Like, I guess I'm saying that, and that's the thing that if I have any disagreement, I think it's that. I think it's that part where it's this need for, there needs to be brutal violence. We need to go murdering people in order to make this shit work. And it's like, whoa. So what if your mom gets killed? What if your dad gets killed? What if your uncle or your postman? Like, who are you willing to get axed in order to bring about this revolution? And I guess I would wager that the answer is probably, I get a little squeamish when you're talking about somebody who you're close to getting killed on this. There has to be a better way. I mean, there has to be a better way.
If there was a better way, we would.
Right here, Danny Knapp. He needs to make his case of why it's worth it, what is so desirable, and the outcome to justify it. I think it's funny. I can make this argument for you on that one. I think your argument would be the outcome is a system that is, look, there's a certain amount of violence that's associated with poverty. It's this anonymous violence where the society itself has allowed people to go without their needs being met. For all the talk of freedom, there's no such thing as freedom if a person doesn't have their needs met. Now, I think your point will be, we need a new society that is based on a new way of going about our affairs that prioritizes human beings first, and that the chaos that it takes in order to get to that society, would you say is worth it?
Yes. I mean, if it can be done another way, if there was a peaceful way to make the world to get that,
How many
then
lives?
I would say do it. As many as it takes.
A million?
If it takes 1 million.
20 million?
If it takes 20 million.
A billion?
Hey.
Really?
Yeah, if that's what it takes.
So let me ask you this. So the genocide of the Native Americans. Now, they would justify that and say, look, we murdered, we committed a genocide of, well, I'm saying we committed a genocide of the Native American population, but look at what we created after that genocide. And somebody says, is it worth it?
But implying you would have had to do that. Was it really necessary? I mean, they didn't do it because, oh, we can do all this. They were just like, no, we actually just want the land, so fuck off, kind of thing.
But Jason, I'm saying the same thing, the same logic kind of applies. I mean, your logic here is whatever it takes. If it takes scorched earth, if it takes nuclear weapons, if it takes 1 million, if it takes 1 billion people dying, fuck it all. It's worth it. And I'm saying that for the most part, that's to some degree a genocide. In the same way that the colonists said they justified it by what we've created is going to be better than what these heathens had. You're kind of making the same argument.
The difference.
Am I wrong? Like, what's the tangible material difference?
I think the difference is, what is it for? What is it going to accomplish? What is the end goal? I know that sounds like ends justify the means.
It literally is just,
yeah, it does. Do you want what's better? And I would argue that a lot of people aren't willing to make that sacrifice because they have it so much better in the first world. Because they don't see it being worth it. That's why there's a revolution in the Philippines. That's why there are people willing to do that killing, because that's what it's going to take. And that's easy for people in the first world to say, well, you know, what about all this killing? Because they don't have to do it.
Correct.
Because they can have a Tulsi Gabbard, because they can have
the reformers,
Bernie Sanders, etc. It really comes down to, do you want a better world or not? And if violence isn't something that wants to be done, then you better be happy with what you got. Essentially,
that better world in your mind has to be drenched in blood.
I'm not saying it has to be. Okay, I actually am saying it has to be. It has to be because it's the only way it's going to happen. If there was an easy, simple way to do it, I would argue for it.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about it from a top-down perspective. Now, you're making this assumption that it has to come through some level of violent revolution from the third world. Now, is it possible that if it's from the perspective of the third world, that maybe from the perspective of the third world where you have nothing else to lose, it is easier to pick up a weapon? For example, if it's not so much that you may love ISIS, you may just not like the United States in your territory, and ISIS is the fastest thing running. Meaning, I guess I'm making a point. I don't think you join ISIS if your life is going fucking awesome. I do think you join ISIS if things are so bad that not doing something is essentially worse than doing something. Like, so in our situation, like you said, first worlders, it's somewhat of a pain in the ass to pick up a weapon and go, robbing a post office. That's not something we want to do. We have a job, we have a family, we have responsibilities, and those things cloud us to the pain that other people are feeling in other parts of the globe. Those people in other parts of the globe, however, are feeling that pain. And in feeling that pain, they may be incentivized to say, we need to do something. In which case, like you say, you get your violent revolutions. Is it possible, however, that a top-down revolution coming from a first world would not necessarily require that violence? Because the changes that are being made will affect those changes or those people in the third world. Meaning, if it's a top-down revolution, violence may not necessarily be necessary, as opposed to if it's a third world revolution where violence was probably the likely result.
To that, I would answer.
Does that make sense?
It definitely just makes it definitely makes sense. But what happens when you start equalizing wealth across the world? I mean, the U.S. overconsumes by 4 times what is sustainable for the rest of the world. Now, like, what happens when you take, 3/4 of that away? Are people going to be okay with that? Going from their privileged position to a material, not necessarily worse, but a materially lower form of living, like not being able to buy a new TV every year kind of thing, are they going to be okay with that? We predict they'll rebel against it. They'll end up in the hands of nationalists who will say, oh, yeah, support us, vote for us, and we'll bring all that back. We'll do America first. We'll make it like the old days.
Jason, I think the thing that bothers me the most is not so much that I think you're wrong. I think part of me thinks to some degree you may be right. And I don't mean that from the standpoint of people need to go and shoot their cops or anything like that. I just mean I look at how we are in this country in America, and I always say this country is not honest about its past. They wiped out an entire culture, Native American population, and then took another generation and put it into slavery, or another culture and put it into slavery, and then instantiated certain systems in place to try to explain why that genocide was necessary and good, and why the slavery was right. God said so.
I think the mistake is that it kind of paints all violence as the same.
Well, no. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at I'm actually bolstering your argument here. In our society, you have a certain wealth distribution that you can see based on how African Americans were treated in the society. I mean, you're talking about all the way up to like the 80s or the 90s, where people were blocked from certain jobs or blocked from taking certain housing areas and stuff like that. There's never an honest conversation about wealth. And so you have one part of the population that suffers, like literally brutally suffers. And you have another part of the population that pretends as if all the wealth gains that it has accrued is purely of its own making. That's not honest. You've essentially was able to use a ton of labor from people without necessarily giving any reparations for the labor that you were able to get, and then turn around and say, you people need to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. That's not an honest appraisal of history, nor is it an honest way of trying to go about your affairs if you're trying to bridge the gap from racial politics. Now, true, I say that to say, but I say that to say, I think to some degree you're probably right, which bothers me. Meaning, if we can't even do it in this country where we have an honest appraisal of it, why will we be able to do it across international borders? I understand your argument, and I understand where you're coming from. I guess I don't want to think that is completely necessary in that way. But my feeling is things will probably come to a crash before this kind of false consciousness breaks, where we realize, because look,
it's going to take a crash to break it.
Because I think nobody likes to give up their advantage. Like I give you an example. There's a guy I used to work with, the owner of the company, Democrat, and you could have conversations with him, except when you bring up class. Bring up class, that shit ends, because at that point you're talking about his ends. He can be a lefty all he wants until you get to the point of saying, well, look, we have a class problem in this country and people aren't necessarily having this conversation about class. And I would make the argument, plutocrats don't really care about you, so you shouldn't really give a shit about them. You should go for the 99%. At that point, that conversation ends. He's like,
yeah, pretty much. That's it. Until you start questioning, it's like you start talking about white privilege, and a lot of white people get mad.
They get mad.
Start talking about class privilege, and they start to get mad.
Yeah. So I feel you on this. I just, the violence thing bothers me, and I think any notion of the violence thing is going to create certain systems in place that is going to create a vast negative reaction. And I strongly suspect that a Martin Luther King type movement is probably a stronger movement in this sense, taking the moral high ground as opposed to I'm grabbing my gun and I'm going to shoot a cop. Those things are somewhat different. And I think, even though I understand the argument, so I'm saying two things, and it sounds like I'm saying two things out of my mouth, but I'm not. I'm saying I understand the argument from the perspective of somebody saying, I don't know how you get from point A to point B without some intervening chaos. By the same token, I make this point of, if you're dealing with top down and trying to change the system, if something happens from the standpoint of the top, meaning the economic system collapses, you may not necessarily need that level of violence in order to make things change. The chaos itself may be enough. I'm not wed to this idea that the only way change can come is through violence. but I know that you disagree with me on this. But I think both of us have a better understanding of how we see it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what would be a perfect example of what you're talking about is what Venezuela is trying to do right now.
Yes. Yeah.
They're trying to
Explain. Are you aware of what's taking place? I know a little bit about it, and I
Yes.
know what the media has been portraying it as. If you want, you could explain it before we head out.
They're essentially trying to do just that, peacefully install socialism. Okay, great. I support them. I hope it works. Like, I really hope that they get it, but they are suffering so much because of it. I sometimes I wonder, you know, what the hell Maduro is even doing. Like, take the capital away from the capitalists. That's what gives them power, is their ownership of capital. Take
Is
that
it
shit.
is it possible? See, this is what I mean when I say I actually I think I to some degree agree with Marx on this. Maybe he was right after all. Maybe the revolution does have to come from the more powerful nations. For example, if it came from the United States, what happens to the rest of the world if the United States starts taking a certain disposition? Does that, by definition, change these other places? Like, because think about what's taking place right now. The United States is the one that's taken this role in attacking Nicaragua, Venezuela, economic sanctions on Iran, literally even going to the full point of saying we're going to attack countries in Europe if those countries continue to do business with Iran. Well, we're the one that broke the deal. Like, this is some amazing shit that's taking place.
Yeah,
The balls are stunning. But what happens if the capitalistic country itself, the main one, is broken, meaning the back of it is broken in regards to the way it goes about its affairs? What happens?
that
Like,
is a very, very interesting question.
this is kind of my point. Like, you guys have made this argument, and maybe the argument is somewhat flawed. Maybe Marx was originally right. The argument is third world nations have more of a revolutionary spirit because they have to. They don't necessarily have the reins of power. So if they want to fight back in any kind of way, they have to grab their muskets because, let's be honest, their life is hard and difficult. And between grabbing your musket versus not grabbing your musket may be a better way of going about your affairs. Now, however, if you're in the United States and you're talking about one of the top tier, not the country that goes around attacking other countries that it doesn't particularly like, using sanctions and whatnot, what happens if this country, as Marx was saying, where the revolution needed to take place somewhere like here, which allows a certain cascade through other parts of the globe, does that still require a violent revolution?
That is a very interesting question.
Yes, good. Okay, I'm trying to struggle to pull you out of the grab your muscle.
Yeah, I mean that's a great hypothetical, but has that been the case?
It is not.
I mean, if I could go to bed tonight, wake up tomorrow, and the Venus Project was in full swing, dude, I'd be happy. I would support it.
Yeah,
I would defend it.
but I gotta be honest, I don't know how to get from there to here, or here to there.
They don't even know how to do that.
No, they don't. I've had Roxanne Meadows on the show, and none of them have that answer. I mean, even when you talk to Fresco will, in one of his clips, talks about, yeah, there's going to be chaos. There's going to be chaos.
That's a very vague thing to say. It's true.
It is.
It's true, but it's incredibly vague.
Well, because I don't think he knows.
That's the problem with the Venus Project people, is that they hyper focus on the end result. Okay, right. Cool. I'm with you.
How do you
and they over fetishize technology, in my view. Like, to them, technology is going to solve everything. Now, that can solve certain material things like hunger, housing, etc. But how will the Venus Project solve issues like race? It doesn't really have that much of an explanation. It's kind of like, well, essentially, it's an anti-capitalist argument. Whether they, I'm sure they do say that they're anti-capitalist. I mean, they would essentially have to.
I mean, they're talking about getting rid of money altogether.
Yeah, but they don't talk about what it would take to get there, and I tend to suspect that might be deliberate.
Well, I don't think they know. Like, I think
I'm sure they don't know.
I think in their mind they want to look. I think there's value in, and I know I'm keeping you too long. I'm sorry. I'm going to end it.
Don't worry.
There's value in seeing something that you can't see, like outside something out of your context. I think part of the reason that religion gains so much traction when you're talking about struggle is because people have a hard time seeing beyond their context because the world seems solid. Everything seems, it's like, what does the world look like to a slave? And does that slave believe that slavery was going to end? Well, I'd imagine at one point they probably said no. What does the world look like to people who are in like unions and this kind of worker suffrage? What about, in these hellish countries or theocratic regimes? The world changes. Like, that's the one constant. But it doesn't seem like it changes. And when people are in these struggles, be it, Palestine, or be it in the United States, where you're talking about like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, religion was one of those things that allowed people to see beyond where they are. I think the Venus Project showing this kind of end result is positive. I think it's necessary. I think it's like Star Trek showing this thing of, this is what we can be. We can arrange ourselves in any way. Like you said, the issue becomes, how the hell do you get there?
I got no problem with discussing alternatives. But the problem before us is, how do we get to them?
Yeah.
I mean, you could come up with a million solutions, but how do you get to them?
Yeah. So let me I'm gonna say, is there anything else that we didn't necessarily talk about that you might want to mention? You mentioned Sanders, you mentioned Ocasio-Cortez. I think we talked about that. Your perspective of the Democratic Party, is it possible for change to take place in the Democratic Party?
I don't think so, because they're still reliant on capital, big capital, to back them up. And they're going to do that. I mean, we saw that, I don't care what people say about Russia conspiracy. Hillary Clinton did screw over Bernie Sanders.
Of course she screwed over Bernie Sanders. And then the wild part about it is,
that's the point. That's what's going to happen every time there's a Bernie Sanders or a Cortez or a Tulsi Gabbard. That same thing is going to happen. Whether that's, Hillary Clinton like screwing them over, or forging the votes for who it's going to be, who's the head of the party. That's just going to happen again and again.
What do you think about the new ruling for the superdelegates? Have we reached that kumbaya moment where we're, running bare-chested in the sun, holding our hands into the air together at last, or is this? No. I have a particular perspective of this. I feel like they're trying to sell this. But what is your perspective of the superdelegates thing?
If it was really a solution to the problem, would they be offering it to you?
I thought they were just trying to ram it down our throats. Honestly, there were two scenarios, because I tried to look at this and like, well, wait a minute, this is nothing. I mean, this is nonsense. Like, so for example, the first scenario is what we have in 2016. Let's assume for the moment that Bernie Sanders had more pledged delegates, but not enough to win the plurality, meaning not necessarily enough to win, but more pledged delegates. Well, Hillary Clinton gets her super delegates, in which case she wins. First round. It's done. Let's say in the second scenario, we apply the new rule set. So in this case, again, Bernie Sanders has more pledged delegates. Hillary Clinton has super delegates, but they don't count because they don't count on the first round voting. But Bernie Sanders doesn't have enough for plurality to win, so you go to the second round. All of those super delegates is already still aligned up with Hillary Clinton. And when they said they were going to get rid of 65%, they're not getting rid of any. And all of those super delegates who were right there lining up for Clinton are now right there again, still with her. They're going to vote for her in the second round, meaning whether they vote for in the first round or the second round, what's the difference? And even going beyond that point, we're supposed to believe that the media is not going to go to each and every one of those super delegates in advance and say, hey, just in case this election, is not, we can't decide it on the first round, who are you voting for? And they're going to do what they did this time and say, there's these super delegates are saying they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton to the tune of X by, X over Y. I don't see, they're selling this as if this is some big triumph. And I can't tell if Sanders understands that this is a loss to some degree, and they don't want to own up to the fact that it's a loss, because ultimately they want to have this united front as if we're making positive steps forward. I talked to Jordan. Jordan was, and I was like, dude, what am I missing on this? And as we talked through it, he's like, well, maybe they'll be less inclined to vote for Hillary Clinton if Sanders won the first vote, like if he won a little bit more in the vote. I said, but more likely than not, they would have voted for Hillary Clinton anyway, and the Democrats would have backed them. So yeah, that's true. Sorry, that's me going on a diatribe. I guess I don't see it. I agree with you. I don't see this thing being this kind of positive change, or this massive change is the way they're trying to sell it.
Yeah, if it would really change anything, would they really let you do it?
So, Danny Knapp, how about attacking the currency? If we refuse to use the dollar, doesn't that end capitalism with no balance? An idea I've been kicking around. So, like, say, for instance, if people say, you know what, we're going to conserve the amount of money that we spend. I don't think that's going to work, Danny. And I'll tell you why after, but I'm going to let you respond to that. So, what if we attack the currency by refusing to use the money?
I mean,
I don't know how you do that, but
yeah, I don't know how you'd pull that off. But let's say you do pull it off. You would cause an economic crisis, and that would
yeah,
open the door to what we were talking about earlier.
fashion.
If I mean, no, it could also open the door to change. If you cause the system to collapse, that leaves the door open for anybody who wants to change it. I think it's just a matter of like deliberately causing a crisis. I'm not opposed to that, but essentially, yeah, it would just be like destabilizing it to the point where you could take action. I mean,
And
I don't care how dedicated the cops are; they're not going to go out there and do it for free.
you don't think so?
I don't think I think that they
I think
might
some might.
for
Let me
a
say it this way. I
bit.
think some might. I think some may think to themselves, I'm doing the best for my society. Well, here's the thing, though. I guess my thing is, if you
Until
do
his
that,
family starts getting hungry and he's got nothing to buy food with,
well,
then his opinion. I'm sure for a while they'll work for free, but in the long run they won't.
yeah, because at the end of the day, they still need to feed their kids. Well, the problem with this is, though, people still need to eat. It's like, how are you not using money? I guess unless the idea is you don't use it for things outside of just like food and so forth. It's like you're just conserving it to the basic needs. Um, I don't know how that works. The American capitalistic system is literally built off of buying stupid shit that you don't necessarily need. That's eventually going to end up in a landfill someday. Um, it's an odd system. It's like we have finite resources, and yet the whole system is built on using those resources as fast as possible because that's how people make their profits, and that's how people keep their jobs, and that's how this Ponzi scheme keeps ticking along. Trudy, day after overthrow government, military rule, got a plan. No, must strike, boycott, and use civil disobedience, not violence. What do you guys say about that one?
I'm not sure the question. They're saying after.
Oh, so Trudy. So she says, day after you overthrow the government, like day after the revolution, government is
Yeah.
overthrown. Military rules. Do you have a plan? And she's saying, no, you must strike, boycott, and you must use civil disobedience, not violence.
I mean, if you don't have a plan, then I guess that would be the best thing in lieu of a plan.
Okay.
But remember, somebody's going to have to run the central bank. Somebody's going to have to control how the money's working. Somebody's going to have to make the bank work. Somebody's going to have to run the factories.
I guess her point is the military is it's going to be like Egypt, where the military takes over, and for the most part, you have no longer civilian rule of authority. I think, the National Defense Authorization Act has allowed the United States to put military on home soil if it believes there is some kind of terrorist disturbance. Terrorist, in this case, is just kind of an open-ended thing that could be anything that the government applies it to. I think her point is the first thing that is going to happen is that the military is going to land on the soil and it's going to start shooting people in the face. And military is going to take over the government of the United States. And I understand that people are going to have to run the factories and everything else, but I would almost wager that people are going to run the factories because, like you said, in the first world scenarios, this is all they know.
Yeah.
Like there's no, like, I understand what you mean. This idea of revolutionary fire is not there. I often look at people and I'm like, why are you such sheep? Like,
just look at any Trump voter. Like, it doesn't matter what Trump does wrong. Like, it doesn't matter how bad he fucks up. They have some kind of defense for it.
It's so bizarre to me. Like, it's like this guy is giving over $1 trillion to the top 1%, and you're still supporting him as he's looking out for your benefit. It's amazing. And even for the working class, like I look at this stuff and say, the 99% keeps the lights on, like you said, runs the factories. It pulls the trash off the street. It essentially runs society, period, lock, stock, and barrel. Among the people who you don't need in the society are the elites. What you do need is the workers, and you need the resources. Now, I look at the situation, and yet the society itself doesn't look at it that way. And in the same odd way where Parliament gets into a fight with the king, Parliament wins and still say we need a king. that's kind of the way it feels like with the capitalistic system. You know, it's like we need CEOs, we need elites, and all this other stuff. It's like that's
basically what happened in Canada.
Say it one more time.
That's basically what happened in Canada. Oh, we don't need a monarchy. We can have our own democracy. Okay, well here's a democracy where the Queen's still the head of state.
That's so weird. That's so weird. I asked somebody one day. I said, "What happens if the Queen doesn't like one of the laws?" The Queen
has the absolute authority to change any law that she wants. She can completely dissolve Parliament, get rid of it, and appoint people to take its place. She can declare martial law, but she has enough representatives in the capitalist class that's not going to be necessary.
But I mean, but can Parliament, for the most part, like they've already had that fight between Parliament versus essentially the Commons versus the Crown, and the Crown lost that. And yet, because let me say, the day after the Queen does that, when Parliament come out and pass a law stripping the powers from the Queen, like the conversation that they have in many cases now from like Corbynites is, are we going to strip powers from the monarchy?
I mean, do it.
Like, I don't live there, so I don't know the full rulings, but I know it's a weird constitutional crisis if the Queen starts, you know, I want to have ice cream to everybody on Thursday, and they're like, what the hell? What the fuck is wrong with the Queen?
My question is, why does anybody listen to the Queen at all?
You know, I find this to be amazing. It's like they're pretending, and they have a lot of other people pretending that they're royalty. It's just a person. Like somebody was born into a family line, and they're like, we're going to bestow this person with royalty. Why? They just were born into a family line. It's just so weird to me. It's so weird to me.
I don't see any real rational justification for continuing to have the royal family. It's just, a lot of people say, well, it's tradition. Well, it's a big waste of tax money for tradition.
Yeah, it's time for us to grow up. Dude, Jason, you have no idea how much I appreciate you coming on to the show. I find this conversation amazing. Usually I am on the other side of this conversation screaming fire and, you know, pitchforks. And I find my revolutionary spirit to be tamped down when I'm talking to you. You're like, it's like, grab the gun and shoot somebody in the face. Let's get this shit going. It's like, whoa. But I'm enamored by this conversation. I appreciate this conversation. I don't think I've ever had a conversation like this.
I greatly enjoyed it too.
Oh, very cool, man. I really appreciate this. Look, is there anything that you want to say before I end the channel? Before I end?
Check out my website, mouserebelnews.com, youtube.com/user/mouserebelnews.
Very cool.
I guess that'd be it. And if you want me back on, just say.
No, man, I appreciated this. I love this conversation. I'm fascinated by your character arc, like how you ended up into this, because it's such, like you said, it's such a distinct section, you know what I mean, of what you consider to be the left, or what people would consider to be the left. Let me ask you this: what is the end result? So, assume for the moment you get your revolution. What is the world you're trying to get in that sense? Like, I understand socialist government, but paint that picture for the people, because ultimately you're saying that the balance is worth it, regardless of what that balance is. If there's 1 billion people that die through fire and ash, then 1 billion people have to die through fire and ash, because the world we're going to create afterwards is going to be fucking lovely. What does that world look like?
Well, largely, I'm going to describe a socialist system. We begin reorganizing the allocation of resources in the world towards human need, as opposed to profit. Because what is socially rational, it's not necessarily what's economically rational.
Yes, those are different things.
Yeah, that's basically the whole point of capitalism, is to say to hell with human need and work for profit. Say a more equitable distribution. Once you have that basis of real equality, you could start getting rid of a lot of other things. You could start getting rid of a lot of other oppressions at the same time, because like you're not going to get to say you're going to get equality under capitalism is just like ridiculous. Like, how is a system that's predicated on inequality going to create equality?
Equality.
The question is, how do you transition from socialism to communism? That is a question that has not been answered yet.
Yeah.
That's something that we're going to have to come to when the time is, when we reach that stage. We're going to have to figure out how to do it. Now, we're not claiming to have all the answers, but we're saying that when it comes up, we'll be able to see more than we can see now.
Let me ask you this: why has I think a question that people often ask is this thing of repressive governments, whether you're talking about Stalin or whether you're talking about, even if you're talking about Mao to some degree, because let's be honest, a lot of people died under that scenario. Now, I don't let capitalists get away with making those assertions, because at the end of the day, we're talking about capitalists who, you know, exploit other lands for their. So they would say, well, hey, capitalistic countries are free. Well, it depends on who's at the end of the boot. If you're talking about Guatemala, if you're talking about Venezuela, if you're talking about, the countries where they're taking their oil, if you're talking about, this capitalistic expansion into these other countries, it's not free for those other countries. They're putting in brutal dictators in those countries. So it's like, yes, there's a consequence for what you consider to be this kind of quote unquote bourgeois freedom of being able to choose Pepsi and Coke. But what do you respond to that with? I'm just curious. This thing of.
To which I would answer, as Lenin said, freedom for whom? To do what?
To do what? Yeah.
The idea of some kind of like libertarian, anybody can just do whatever they want.
Yeah,
kind of thing. That's not gonna happen. Every society has rules. Every society has to have rules in order for it to function. Well,
no, I'm getting at something more specific. So, for the standpoint of Mao and Stalin, those are the tropes that are used to essentially attack the left. They try to make this argument that socialism doesn't work because of Stalin. Like you said it earlier, Marxism, Stalinism, as if those things are actually like absolutely the same, and that one automatically leads to another. What is the answer to that? What do you say about that?
Any system is going to do whatever it has to keep itself together, to hold itself in order to allow it to function. There's absolutely no exception to this.
Oh, wait. So you're saying that the reason, so how those systems turned up, or the outcome of those systems was necessary in order for those systems to propagate themselves, like essentially for the
not in every case, but generally speaking, like there were some excesses, of course, but not in every case. But generally speaking, every society, right down from a hunter-gatherer society to the most advanced technological society, you will need laws and means by which to hold it together.
Yeah, but I guess that's a different question than Stalin killing millions of people. I mean, and look, I know some of the deaths have been overstated, like at least from the standpoint of the purges, but the death toll was tremendous. And now, is the death toll from Stalin because they were trying to keep up with the West? Like, whereas, they looked at there was an existential threat, in which case we need to do what we need to do in order to make sure the threat is subjugated, or just the threat is held at bay. What is the answer to that? I don't associate Marxism with Stalinism. I don't. I consider those things to be different. I consider those things to be very different. Workers owning the means of production is not the same thing as Stalin and his, this kind of authoritarian socialism of sorts. But the association is often made. And when people are talking to you, oftentimes they would say communism, Stalinism. What is the difference? Like, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Maybe that's the question I'm trying to nail. What is the difference between a Stalinism versus a communism? You've kind of alluded to it, saying that we haven't made the transition between socialism and communism. We've never seen it. So what is the difference between what you advocate from the standpoint of this kind of maybe a Maoist communist type idea versus Stalinism or versus Maoism? Well, we are.
I would say that it goes in a matter of development. Socialism is what's between capitalism and communism, to transition to that best of all worlds that we know of. I mean, Marx said something's going to come after communism. We just don't know what it is.
I guess. But does all roads of socialism lead to authoritarian dictatorships? I guess that's what I'm getting at, because that's the argument that's always thrown.
I question that the Soviet Union was not a dictatorship, and that there's significant evidence. I mean, it's there that Stalin tried to step down 5 times.
Stalin tried to step down 5. Now, to be fair, I am not a scholar on the intricacies of specifics. Like I can nail down war for World War I, World War II, Korea. I can nail down the wars, all these little details in the wars. But I got to be honest, I've never heard that Stalin has tried to step down 5 times.
If Read Grover Fur. Grover Fur is a historian on this, and he's got a lot on the subject in those regards. Now, keep in mind that in the period of Stalin, they knew Germany was rising and that there was going to be another war. They could see like Stalin's diary from like 10 years before, World War II happened.
Right.
They knew it was coming because that was part of Lenin's theory that there's going to be another world war. In fact, Lenin predicted there would be a repeated series of world wars. They said, okay, this is coming and we're still like the most backwards country in Europe. We have to get the job done now. We have to industrialize now or we're going to be destroyed.
That part is true.
Get it done. If it takes an iron hand to do it, then that's what it takes.
Okay, I see your argument. All right, I see the argument.
The Soviet Union didn't have threats around it, which any socialist country is always going to have threats around it, so long as capitalism exists. Then they could have done things easier. They could have done it perhaps slower, in a more peaceful manner. But if that threat, the threat of a growing Germany exists, they have to get it done. That's why there was such a huge emphasis on industrialization.
Okay, I see what your argument is. Okay, that makes more sense. All right, so just so making sure I'm articulating this right. Essentially, any state is going to try to persist itself. Meaning, the moment that a state becomes a thing, it has somewhat of an internal internal clock or internal apparatus that kind of persists itself. Meaning, it's going to make decisions and actions that allows it to persist. And if there's threats, it's going to try to mitigate those threats, even if that means taking difficult, brutal decisions to mitigate those threats. So in this case, the threat was external forces such as Germany. And Germany had already killed, 10 million Russians in the First World War. And they knew that things were kind of going rocky by the time the Second World War came around. And so the goal was we need to industrialize immediately. Like even at the expense of millions, we need to industrialize immediately.
I would argue that millions of people didn't suffer because of it, but not in terms of deaths. I mean, it depends on what exactly you're referring to.
Well, I thought millions died under Stalin.
No, usually that's aimed at the famine in the 30s, but that was largely not their doing. It was a famine that struck Europe in general.
Well, also they were finding, especially during the war, one of the things that they found that kind of embarrassed the Allies. I mean, because Stalin was an ally, people sometimes forget that Soviet Union was on our side. Was bodies, like mass graves of. I guess we're getting off the rails. I guess my point is, the argument that's being made here, for the most part, is one that essentially, look, that state had threats associated with it, and if it didn't necessarily have threats, maybe it wouldn't necessarily have developed in the way that it developed. Like the people pretend as if it developed in a vacuum, and it didn't develop in a vacuum.
No.
Not to mention, let's be honest. I think the methods that they took to get to where they needed to was somewhat brutal. But at the same token, you had a country that went through a civil war, went through another world war, and within the course of X number of years was the superpower, like a number 2 superpower. And it's like, but Jesus Christ, the toll that it took in order to do it. So,
to which I would answer, there's a great quote by Che Guevara. Look at the I forget if Aztecs or Incas. I think it was the Mayans. Yeah. They had agriculture. They had aqueducts, rudimentary brain surgery. They had all this super advanced shit. But the Spanish had gunpowder.
Yeah. Yeah. Those high-minded ideals.
You could be the most advanced, intelligent, super advanced people, but in the end, if you don't have the gun, you're the one who's going to suffer. They were so far ahead in certain areas, but the Spanish had gunpowder.
They had gunpowder. Wow. All right, man. Look, I totally appreciate you coming here. It's funny, you and I were sitting here talking before we even got on the show. Anytime you want to come on the show to talk, man, you're more than welcome. Your perspective is welcome. Look, I disagree with the violent revolution thing. I think that is problematic. Because I think it's one thing to say it. It's another thing to have a weapon in your hand and pull the trigger and blowing somebody's brains out. which is essentially what you're talking about. Like that's there's a difference in saying it in this kind of glorious revolution, and I think a lot of lefties feel this in somewhat of this kind of internal way, where it's like, oh, they get up on this. But I think there's a reality to it, and that reality to it is, going through rivers of blood for uncertain means. I understand the perspective. I just disagree with it, even though I don't have a clear path to get from point A to point B. So, I thought this conversation was illuminating. I thought it was awesome. So,
yeah, it was good.
Thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the patron. And I am Siler. Socialism isn't communism. Okay, I am Siler. Socialism is not communism. Socialism is an intermediary between those two things. It's supposed to be a holding point until you get to the point where you can actually have a communistic system where the government kind of falls away. Let's see. Gardner. Yep, I'm sick of the tough talk guys from people who have never engaged or been engaged in large scale chaos or violence. And
we're not arguing whether or not I would be revolutionary. We're arguing whether or not it's necessary.
Right.
That's complete nonsense.
Oh, I see what you mean. You're okay. That's fair. That's somewhat of a distinction. You're saying, no, I'm not saying go out and do this. I'm saying whether or not this is necessary to get change. Okay, that's a distinction. All right. I'm going to end this here. Guys, thank you guys for showing up. And you guys are awesome. I think this was an awesome conversation. And we had a pretty good crowd here. So I'm going to end it here. Thanks, everyone.